Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this online event. After a break since the summer, I'm really delighted that the St John's College online series is back this evening with an excellent talk in prospect on the Virtual Rome project. Before I get to introducing our speaker, can I just go through one or two housekeeping items? I think you all know, because I can see that most of you have muted yourselves, and please would you also keep your cameras off during the talk. Dr. Nicholls is very keen that you should ask questions at the end, so please, if you would paste them into the chat as we go along, then I will ask you to come on the screen and give your question at the end of the talk. And also, I would just like to make you aware that the talk is being recorded, and afterwards we will be sharing it on the college's website and social media. So I hope and I know you're going to enjoy what is to follow. So let me now turn to our speaker, who is my colleague, Matthew Nicholls. Many of you will know Matthew is an alumnus of St John's. He matriculated in 1996 as an undergraduate in classics, and then again in 2000 to embark on graduate studies here in college, where he was the college's North Scholar in 2002. He then went on to a junior research fellowship at Queen's College before taking up an academic position at the University of Reading in 2017, where he proceeded through the ranks. In 2014, he was awarded the Guardian Higher Education Award for Teaching Excellence, and he was promoted to a professorship, a personal professorship in 2018. He now continues as a visiting professor at Reading, but we are very lucky that he was appointed to be our senior tutor in January 2019. Just 1 year before the pandemic, which was a year in which he was fighting more fires than many of us can imagine. Matthew is a Roman historian. He's an expert on the social and political history of ancient Rome, and particularly interested in how the Romans designed their environments to reflect their values and their priorities. He became interested in computer modeling as a way to bring ancient cities to life, and that's something we're going to hear about tonight. His 3D constructions of Rome have featured in TV documentaries on the Discovery Channel and elsewhere across the world. He's very often invited as a keynote speaker. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Matthew Nicholls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people joining us in this virtual room. A particular greeting to any old St John's friends. As you heard, I am an alumnus, so I suspect out there might be people who were my fellow students here a while ago, and it's lovely that you've come along. So I'm working on a large digital reconstruction of the city of Rome as it appeared in the early 4th century AD, roughly speaking. I could say quite a lot more about dates, but I won't right now. My academic work that I embarked on at St John's as a graduate student was a doctorate on the subject of Roman public libraries. And in the process of writing that, I wanted to illustrate these buildings. And I turned to computer modeling as I thought, a very effective way of creating the kinds of visualizations I wanted to use in my thesis. And moving on from there, I made more and more of the city of Rome until I ended up making an architectural model of the entire city of Rome as it appeared in about AD 315, should we say. And that's what I'm going to show you this evening. So if I share my screen, I should be able to show you that. Here it is. So I hope you can see that now. So that's my model of the city. And we can fly into it. We're now over the city and we're going to fly in from the south. So you can see it's a 3D entity. We start in map view and we can rotate it and look at it in perspective. I've developed this very large scale model of the city as a teaching tool, as a presentation tool, as a way of showing people the city, but also getting people to think about architectural space and talk about it. And increasingly as a research tool and for outreach, public facing work, as you heard about, and what we call impact in the university sector, the public facing impact of research. So this evening I intend to show you some of what the model contains, how, if you wish to, you can access it and see some more of it, to talk about some of the practical challenges that arose in making it, some of the methodological or intellectual challenges that arose, and a bit about what I do with it, how it's used. What is a digital model? Well, you can see on the screen that it produces hopefully a fairly convincing 3D image of the city, and you can fly around it. It's maneuverable. It's made in 3D drawing software on my computer. So here is another screen grab of me drawing a rather simple building. This is a Romano-British villa from Beedlam in Yorkshire, as it happens. And this is the drawing software I typically use. It's a very user-friendly program called SketchUp, which I teach to primary school children. It's very easily graspable. This video is speeded up by a factor of 4, so about 2 minutes of video. It's only about 8 minutes of modeling time. I don't know if we'll get to the end of it, but you can see what's going on here, that I start with a ground plan scanned into the computer and then extrude from that a series of 3-dimensional shapes and add detail and eventually add color and texture. And that creates a 3-dimensional model inside the computer. You can see in the drawing process, I can rotate around it and look at it from different sides. The aim is to show what this building may have looked like. As these Roman buildings are now vanished or exist only as ruins, usually we have to use evidence and conjecture to make these reconstructions. What sorts of evidence? Well, archaeological remains, as revealed by the excavators and documented in this ground plan, but also ancient descriptions in literary texts, pictures of vanished buildings that the Romans themselves made, maps, pictures on coins, inscriptions. I'm a historian by training, really, rather than an archaeologist, and I use a lot of literary sources, epigraphic, numismatic sources, like a historian would. This is a rather simple building. You can see I'm using a pre-made library of doors and windows now to add a little bit of quick detail. So this is a fairly simple and easy building to make. That only took a couple of minutes, and there it is. A rather more complicated one is this bathhouse in the city of Rome, the Baths of Caracalla. Here is a work in progress cross-section through the building. And you can see that the process, although more complicated here, is essentially the same. I start with the ground plan, I visit the building, and you can see it survives very impressively in Rome in the photograph top left, and then draw in the missing elements to complete and give an impression of those things that were once there but have gone. So in this case, the roof vaults have collapsed, there's no more glass in the windows, the mosaics and the marble have been stripped out, the water is drained from the pools, the statues have been robbed out. So only the hulk, the core of the building survives. The reconstruction can aim to reconstitute those missing elements. Why do this? Partly because these models are maneuverable, dynamic, immersive, and they can get you into the building or give you a different kind of sense of what these buildings or urban spaces look like. And you can use them fairly flexibly. So here is that model of the bathhouse now with colors and light and shade integrated within a topographical model of the city. You can see there's bits of surroundings, the city wall behind it, and some suburban buildings around it. And this sort of digital model allows you to explore the building for yourself. If you wish to explore a building for yourself, for the next few slides, bottom left is a QR code. If you have about you a second device like a phone or a tablet, if you want to point the camera at that QR, it should take you to a model of the Pantheon in Rome, and you can fly around it on your phone screen, with your finger on your device. If you don't want to do that now or it doesn't work, don't worry, I'll show you a video later of what it would look like. And I've sent a sheet of all these QRs for lots of Roman buildings to the people organising the talk, and they can drop that in the chat if you want to play around with it afterwards. But that QR will sit there for the next 5 minutes if you want to try grabbing it with your device. And this is a new way of exploring Roman buildings, but the idea of reconstructing the past is not new at all. It's been part of the interpretative toolkit of Roman archaeologists and historians for as long as those disciplines have existed, at least as far back as the Renaissance, arguably further. For as long as people have been encountering the ruins of the ancient past, they've been trying to match those ruins to literary descriptions and other sources of evidence, and to think about what these buildings were once like in their prime, and then to depict that. And really that's what I'm doing. It's a continuation of a very ancient discipline. And lots of media have been used to try to do that over the years. Most conventionally, a 2D black and white ground plan, like you see on the slide here. And this shows a lot of information very clearly and concisely. It has a consistent scale. It embodies states of knowledge about what is known and what is conjectured. It also has the modern street plan in it. There's a lot of information there, but it presents that information in a way that's quite stylized, and that, in my experience, students, people in tour groups, that kind of thing, don't always have the facility to read this kind of plan. Don't always know how to take this and turn it in the mind's eye into a three-dimensional building. And it's that sort of gap of interpretation I've tried to fill with what I do. The perspective drawing takes us a little way towards that. Now we have the missing elements of height that the ground plan doesn't give us. Perspective. If you move from drawing to a watercolor painting, like Perlin's beautiful watercolor bottom right from the 19th century, you can add color and light and shade and a sense of movement. And these are wonderful resources too, but they also have their limitations. There's a fixed point of view. You can't rotate it, as some of you may now be rotating the Pantheon on your phones. You can't shift your perspective. You can't turn around to look behind you or take a different view. And the Perlin watercolor is giving us an interesting tension between apparent realism, right, little people frozen in a real moment of time, and unreality, because it's a cross-section through the building. Like, no viewer ever actually saw this because Perlin's removed half the building to give you this view down its length. And that tension between realism or verisimilitude and information is something else that runs through my work and some of what I'm going to say. So drawings, paintings are wonderful, but they have their limitations. Some of those limitations can be addressed by physical models. This is a lovely plaster and cork model of the Pantheon from the 18th century. And if you know the Pantheon, you'll know that the trick it plays is from the outside, it looks like a conventional temple. And then when you walk into it, this wonderful dome space above you, like the vault of the heavens, an ancient author says, totally transforms your idea of what a Roman temple is or can be. And the modeler has cleverly allowed you to experience that in miniature by putting the building on hinges, so you can open it and see the inside, or close it up and see the outside view. So physical models have a long heritage too, and I've enjoyed experimenting with those. The architects Foster and Partners recently opened a new Roman museum in Narbonne in southern France, and they commissioned a series of digital models from me that their model studio turned into physical models. And that was a joy to make. And when I went to the museum to see these things in the opening display, it's very interesting to observe how people interact with them. Almost everybody was crouching down to put themselves, as it were, into the space. They wanted to almost get inside the model and get the Roman's eye view, which chimes a bit with how I tend to use digital models. The most ambitious physical model of Rome ever made was this whole city model by Italo Gismondi, which took several decades to make in the middle 20th century. It's in a museum that is shut in Rome and has been shut for years, sadly, but when you can visit it, you view it from a gallery. You can't actually do this trick of getting right down to street level because it's fragile and delicate and a museum piece in its own right. And so they keep the viewing public up in a gallery at some distance from it. So it's a wonderful thing, but it's hard to access and it's hard to use. So alongside plans and drawings and physical models, and paintings, I propose that we can add digital models, not as a replacement, not as the only thing we should ever be doing henceforward, but as an extra tool in the toolkit for people in the business of reconstructing and representing the past. So here is a plan of the building, here is a physical model of the building, here is a digital model of the building. And I think digital models have some features, some affordances that transcend some of the limitations of these other media, though no doubt they bring limitations of their own. They're a little bit more flexible than a static 2D image would be, and they're more shareable and manipulable than a 3D model would be. So we can take a digital model of this bathhouse and do fun stuff with it, like make it semi-transparent and put it on top of the Google Earth of modern Rome. And when I'm teaching Roman bathhouses, I use this slide quite a lot. There's something quite arresting about the scale of this bathhouse. If you look on the left of the image, under those trees on the left, those little matchsticks under the trees are city buses. That's the main bus station outside Rome's train station termini. And if you compare the size of the buses to the size of the swimming pool, for example, you start to get a sense quite intuitively of how enormous this bathhouse is. So we can have fun manipulating digital images and putting them in different contexts. And we can also fade the bathhouse out and see how it's left a sort of fossil imprint on the street plan of modern Rome and then fade it back in again. And when we've done that, we can go from a 2D top-down plan view here and turn that instead into an animated 3D view where we tip up a plan of the building and fly into it. So now we get height and depth, and you can see that we have color, and we have some little visual effects like the reflection in the water. So these models can be rotated, scaled, animated in a way that other media can't, and I think that has some advantage. And if you're playing around now on your phone with the Pantheon, you'll see you can actually do that manipulation for yourself. We can also illustrate change over time, a fourth dimension, if you will, in the model. So this is the ruins of a library building in Timgad in Algeria. Quite hard to visit Algeria at the moment, so you can have a site tour virtually on your desktop, but we can also wind the clock back 1700 years and put back the missing elements and fly into a reconstructed building. So we can show change over time, I think, in a way that's quite flexible with these models. We can do cutaways like Paulan did, but if you make the model right, you can make it reversible. So you can take the roof off, look inside, and then put the roof back on if you wish. And when new discoveries come along, these models are editable in a way that a physical model or a painting aren't really. And I'm constantly reworking my City of Rome and will be forever as new discoveries come along. And we can change parameters like lighting and viewpoint. That means we can use these for researching what it was like to visit these buildings or to be in these buildings, what it was like to be down at street level. And here we are at street level in various points of the City of Rome. We can ask questions like what buildings caught the sun at various points in the year, where were the shadow lines, where were the sight lines, what would a visitor see as he or she approached the building from a particular direction, would that change if they turned around and looked from a different direction? And we can ask what would a Roman or a visitor experience as they entered one of these buildings? What was the intended effect of the building upon the visitor as you move through space? It's an example of that. If you've been to Ephesus in Turkey, you would have encountered this building, which is on all the posters for Ephesus. It's another library, I'm afraid. The Library of Celsus at Ephesus. It hasn't been standing there forever. It actually fell over in an earthquake, I think in the 6th century AD, but then was rebuilt by Austrian architects on a steel frame in the 20th century. So that's already an act of reconstruction, of physical intervention in the fabric of the building. And you can see that a lot of it is still there, but a lot's gone. Right? The roof is gone, the building behind it is gone. Some of the original statues are missing. In fact, they all are. Those ones in the photograph don't belong to the building originally. So digital reconstruction can supplement even a really powerful act of physical, real reconstruction like this. So here's a go at doing that. You can see I've recolored the inscriptions. I put the bronze statues back. The doors are back in the doorways. The window grills are back in the windows. And we can fly into this building and see something of what it may have looked like inside when the books were still on the shelves. So very impressive columnar facade screen, very imposing for the visitor. Then inside, maybe 3 tiers of superimposed book cupboards with author portraits, and you can see some scrolls on the shelves in there. So we can have fun trying to imagine and then represent something closer to the original experience of visiting these buildings. Returning to Rome, we can look not just at individual buildings, but at whole neighborhoods, whole districts. So here is the Campus Martius, a rather gracious district to the north of the center of Rome, noted for theaters. You see several there, athletic stadiums, gardens and parklands, bathhouses, temples, commemorative precincts, quite a gracious part of town. Over here, the dockyard buildings by the Aventine Hill, a much more workaday functional part of town with warehouses and granaries and an entire hill in the bottom of the picture made up of the discarded broken bits of Roman amphorae that had been used for transporting olive oil from Spain and North Africa and dumped in this enormous hill you can see at the bottom of the picture. So buildings in their urban context, I really like viewing with this model, getting a sense of how buildings relate to each other and relate to the topography of the city, to its landscape. And we can pluck buildings out if we wish. So again, if you're teaching bathhouses, you can take them out of the model by cut and paste and do a kind of illustrated typography of the evolution here of the Roman bathhouse. But I tend to find that I use it best when I'm viewing buildings not in isolation, though that's useful, but in the landscape, as here in the Roman Forum, where you can see how the Forum sits in a bowl of hills and what goes on those hilltops kind of has a dialogue with what's happening in the Forum Valley below. And we can strip back the buildings to look at the landscape before the city was there, and that helps us to see that maybe the Forum sits in a space that was once low-lying, marshy, uninhabited, when Rome was a series of hilltop villages in the Iron Age. And the inhabitants of those separate villages met in the valley beneath the hills. And over time, as we fade the buildings back in, fast forwarding 1,000 years here, you can see that marshy land in the middle of the image turns into the Roman Forum, the heart of the entire Roman Empire. So that's what I do, and that's a little bit of why I do it. So far, I've been talking mostly about teaching uses for this model, pedagogical uses, how to show things, how to explain things. We can certainly do research investigations with a model like this as well, a kind of toolkit with which to explore aspects of the ancient city. And if there's time at the end, I'll show you one, or you can ask me about that if you're interested in the questions. It's also useful for public-facing applications. Because this offers, I hope, a fairly accessible, vivid way of looking at the ancient past, it's of a lot of interest to the heritage sector, and as the president said, to broadcasters. And I've done quite a lot of TV work and also some computer games work with it. This is an example. This is a documentary made for the Travel Channel. So it's about how to have a nice holiday in Rome, and they wanted some ancient Rome footage. So this is my model, but made visually rather beautiful by a professional graphic effects firm. You can see some little birds flying around there, smoke coming out the chimneys, this kind of lovely evening light with a misty receding distance. So this is much more cinematic than I would be prepared to be. But for a TV documentary, I think that's fine. And it's quite striking how attractive they've managed to make my model for a television use. There's a balance here between accuracy and visual appeal. And that balance can be quite difficult to strike, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. That balance is also a question when we think about computer games. This is from a demonstration I made with a computer game studio, and this was done in a gaming engine. So this is like a real-time walk around. So the person who took this screen grab was walking around Rome inside a virtual reality helmet. I don't know if you've ever tried one of those, but it's a big helmet you put on with two screens. And you get left and right eye stereoscopic separation, so that the helmet gives you 3D vision, and it has accelerometers in it so it can sense where you're looking. And that, coupled with the vestibular sense of your inner ears, you turn your head around, gives you a real sense of being immersed in the cityscape. I found that very striking. It's a very powerful way to view these buildings. They all seem really big for a start, which you don't get when you're just looking on a 2D computer monitor. So gaming is a big application. I think we'll do more with that. Immersivity, your ability to control and navigate the model, as you may have been playing with on your phones with the Pantheon, I think is a really important factor. And it changes how we use these models and how we experience urban space via these models. So the more I did of this, the more people seemed to be interested in it and wanted to have a go, to experience it. And so we created a public-facing course, a MOOC, an ungainly acronym, a massive open online course. So at Reading, we made this 5-week free MOOC about the city of Rome, which is full of videos of me talking about Rome and articles and maps and diagrams, and videos from the digital model. And I think the unique bit of it is that we also included models that you can download on your phone and explore, as some of you may be doing now, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So we have 5 themed weeks talking about infrastructure, political buildings, religious buildings, kind of urban context of daily life like residential buildings, and then finally buildings for entertainment like theatres and bathhouses, and the Colosseum is our finale. And about 62,000 people now have taken this course around the world, about 190 countries. And so that's really gratifying at the level of doing outreach, of kind of bringing a research subject that I'm very fond of, Roman history, to a big public audience. And I know schools groups have taken that course and kind of taken their class through the course week by week and tweeted about it, and that's very nice to see. So the particular unique function in this course, and there's that QR again if you want to try it, is that you can view bits of the model on your phone. And if you're not making it work for yourself now on your own phone, that's fine. This is what it should look like. So this is me earlier. So you point your camera at the QR and that takes you to a link and the model loads up. And here's the Pantheon. And this is, I was using my finger on the phone screen to do this navigation. So with a little bit of practice, you can pinch zoom in, you can put yourself down at ground level, among those little silhouette people. And you can start to get like a Roman's eye view of the building if that's what you want. And you can also walk through the building. So this is the Pantheon that I showed you that physical model of. And I said, as you walk through the porch, you're suddenly in this enormous dome space. And here we are experiencing that, at least at some level, as a visitor, right? Not just looking at a picture of it, but you're looking around on your phone, on your tablet. And I think that sense of interaction and motion gives something quite different to looking at a picture, even to looking at an animation. It puts you in control. It allows you to think about moving through the space, and it gives you a real-time journey through a space. So if you want to do more of that, you're very welcome to go and sign up for this course, or I've given a sheet of QRs, it's a PDF with the QR codes on it for loads of different Roman buildings, which I think the course organisers will drop in the chat, and you're very welcome to explore those if you want. So there's a lot of potential here. We can have fun with this, we can teach with it, we can do outreach with it. Of course, there are pitfalls here too, as with any intellectual exercise. We can't get too carried away with the novelty or the fun here. There's always a cost-benefit analysis to be done. And I think there's always an honest conversation to have about the limits of our knowledge. The illusion of realism in a project like this is just that, it's an illusion. And that's not always what scholars want to present, right? If I was making a film like Gladiator, illusion is its business, it's quite legitimate. It wants to convince and be real looking, but actually a scholarly reconstruction might want to indicate doubt or variation or gaps in our knowledge. Those are all quite legitimate bits of information that a model would include. It would pull against a kind of photoreal verisimilitude. Any act of reconstruction depends on the skills and the judgment of the reconstructor. And if it's vivid and eye-catching, that's only a good thing if that itself is a desirable outcome of the project. A reconstruction that looks too perfect can be misleading, and I've always kept my models quite deliberately model-y. They kind of look like architectural maquettes. They don't have people in. Someone might ask me about that. That's fine. Well, actually, the one in the Pantheon one does have little silhouette people in as a scale marker, but I don't have kind of Romans in togas going about their Roman business in the forum. So you have to make a series of choices at the outset about what you put in and what you leave out. And some of those choices are kind of methodological, intellectual choices, and some are practical. Here's a bit of footage that heightens that potential tension. This is another scene from that documentary. This is my model again, but kind of prettied up by the filmmakers, and they do this dramatic under the horse's hoof roller coaster ride into the forum. And you can see that they've got very realistic textures, and they've got like a depth of field on the pretend camera lens, so the background is blurry and the foreground is sharp, so it looks like a real camera. And that's all very cinematic and rather attractive. They also deleted an entire temple from the back of the forum here. We should be looking down the forum at the temple of the deified Julius Caesar, and it's gone because they had to create space to fly in under the horse's hoof. And so there's an illustration of that different priorities that I might have doing academic reconstruction versus what a commercial documentary filmmaker might want in terms of drama and visual flair. Other questions that arise as you make a project like this include detail. Detail is really expensive to include. It's expensive in terms of my time because I'm making the whole city of Rome behind me on the screen here. Every click of the mouse, every little bit of detail I add takes more time. And it means my computer has to churn harder when it's rendering the image, that is shining computed light at an image to find out where the shadows are, where the reflections are. Every corner and angle and detail of the building that I add takes more computing time. One fully detailed Corinthian column, that's the kind of the column the Romans use most often. You can see some on the screen with the acanthus foliage at the top, that exuberant architectural foliage. One of those might contain about 50,000 separate vertices and faces in it. So a building like this with 20, 30 column capitals in it suddenly imposes a very heavy load on the computer. So detail is one question. What kind of detail? Do I put dirt in this? Do I put graffiti in it? Do I have smoke coming out the chimneys? Do I have people in there? Talked about that a little bit. At some point, a project crosses a line from reconstructive to kind of cinematic and speculative, and for me, I've drawn that line at this kind of level of detail. Other people will put it in different places, that's fine. So it's a compromise. I don't think there's actually a right or a wrong answer there. There's just a set of choices to be made. Statues, that's another choice. A lot of Roman public buildings were effectively billboards for statues. We know that from the way that Romans talked about them and wrote about them. We know that from the way they depicted them on coins. This is the Temple of Concord in the Roman Forum. That's on this coin. You can see there that the moneyer has taken a lot of care to show that this building was crowded with statues. Statues inside, statues on the steps, statues on the roof. To make it without statues would just be wrong. It would be the wrong impression to give of the building. But the statues themselves are long gone, right? Robbed out, burned for lime, melted down for bronze, smashed up by iconoclasts. They're all gone. So how do we deal with that? We have very imperfect knowledge of the statues. We just have these blobby pictures on the coin. And making statues in the computer is really hard. You need to be a kind of digital sculptor, which I'm not. So the solution I've arrived at is to put blobby humanoid statue figures in there to represent very simplistically, in a kind of stylized way, this building's visual address includes statues in these locations, but I'm not making any kind of detailed claim to know exactly what those statues look like. And I'm not bogging the computer down with very, very heavy, detailed organic shapes of statues either. Another question we have to address, date. When is this model set? I said right at the start, 34th century AD, because that's when all the best buildings exist simultaneously. But at that date, the two sets of buildings on the slide here, they're about 1,000 years apart in, no, they're not about 1,000, beg pardon, they're several centuries apart in date at this period. And the ones on the left, the temples, have been rebuilt successively many times. So some buildings should be looking old and battered and worn, and some should be looking brand new. The arch on the screen reused relief carvings that it robbed out of that imperial forum on the bottom of the screen. So if I want both the arch and the forum in the model, the forum should be looking kind of battered and had bits of it have been robbed out and pinched by a later emperor to adorn his triumphal arch. But I don't want to ruin that forum because I might want to do a whole class on that forum where we fly around it as new. So my models are all simultaneously brand new, which is historical nonsense. But there it is, that's a choice that I made. Another interesting challenge is how we make the urban backdrop of Rome. You can see on the slide here that if I just put in the big monuments, the ones that we know about from archaeology, or because they were important enough that ancient authors wrote about them, then that's what we get. We get a sort of empty map with monuments popping up out of it. That's not a real city, is it? It doesn't tell us anything about the real texture of ancient Rome, about how these buildings were in dialogue with the landscape and around both the built landscape and the natural landscape. If we intend to make use of this kind of reconstruction to research light and shade, to research sight lines, to research movement through space, we've got to put in the clutter, the background, the vast majority of ordinary residential backstreets that make up any city, including ancient Rome. But the trouble is that there's very little evidence for those streets. After the reunification of Italy in the 1860s, when Rome became the secular capital of the new nation state and very rapidly expanded, all of those outlying suburbs, which had been kind of vineyards and market gardens up until that point, were obliterated in this great building boom. And excavation was only really carried out for those monuments that were already poking through the urban texture or were sufficiently important that archaeologists working, for example, under Mussolini demolished medieval and Renaissance Rome to get to them, and we don't do that anymore. So there's much less evidence for the streets of shops and houses and workshops and little ordinary backstreet neighborhoods that characterized so much of ancient Rome. How do we fill in these blanks then? Should we even try to do that? Are we confident that we can reconstruct the general architectural look and feel of the city? If we want to do that, how do we begin to do it? Well, I have done it, as you've seen. There we go. That's the monuments, but now surrounded and framed by this much more, I hope, convincing urban texture of apartment blocks and villas and warehouses and little restaurants and mini piazzas and kind of the whole warp and weft of city life going on around the monuments. So how do we do that? Right? There's very little substantial archaeological information for that. Where do we go? Well, there are some sources, I'm glad to say. There are occasional survivals like this multi-story apartment block. Lots of ancient Romans lived in these, brick and concrete, 4 or 5 story apartment block, shops on the ground floor, apartments on the floors above. This one survived by being turned into a church, and then all the church stuff, or almost all of the church additions, were stripped out again by Mussolini's archaeologists, leaving the core of the building. And there it is, and that's the start of my reconstruction of it at the top of the screen. So we have a few examples. We can also go outside of Rome to places like Ostia, Rome's harbour town, 30 miles down the river. And Ostia, with the harbour silted up and it was abandoned, and so a bit like Pompeii, it's this sort of time capsule. And you can go there and wander around these city streets that survive 2-3 stories tall, and you can get a really good feel for this kind of high imperial brick and concrete, very densely inhabited city. So Ostia is not Rome. It's very important to say there are differences between Ostia and Rome, between Pompeii and Rome. But you can go to Ostia, go to Pompeii, and you can get a sense of what might have been possible in a Roman city. So comparative archaeology is useful. My absolute favourite source, I think, for doing this job of filling in the missing back streets is this thing. This is a marble map of ancient Rome that was commissioned by a dynasty of emperors in the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD. So they surveyed the entire city down to the level, as you can see on this slab, of individual doorways and columns and staircases. And then they carved the resulting map onto a series of very large rectangular marble slabs, and they mounted the whole thing onto the wall of a big public building. So it's this huge demonstration of imperial knowledge of the city and control of the city and kind of care for the inhabitants of the city. I think it's simultaneously the emperor is saying, I care for my people like a father, and also I know where you live. I think both of those messages are in this map. The map fell off the wall in an earthquake and smashed into fragments, and most of those fragments have gone. We have about 10 or 15% of it, and it's like a great jigsaw puzzle for Roman topographers like me. It's like a never-ending fun of working out how the fragments fit together and then where on the map did they belong. And we know from various clues where fragments belong, not all of them, some of them. This one we know goes here on the shoulder of the Quirinal Hill. Various clues tell us that. So I've taken all of the located fragments of this map and I've made all the buildings on them and put them into the model. And the process looks a bit like this. There is the map, and there is my model of the buildings shown on that map, integrated into a terrain model and coloured in, and then extrapolating from that the neighbouring buildings, which are guesswork, conjecture, kind of carrying on that sense of the urban texture and the rhythm of the city, as I think of it, around those buildings. Here's the process in another part of the city, the Esquiline. Locate the fragments, integrate them into a 2D drawing plan, turn that into 3D buildings, put the buildings into the map, colour them in, and there you have that process again from ground plan all the way through to integrated, coloured, textured city. So there are sources that I can consult and have consulted to make this city model. But at some point, we need to turn also to informed guesswork for areas where we have no real data. Lots of buildings whose shape and proportions and size we might derive from the best comparable data, but at the level of individual buildings have simply vanished, are essentially fictional. I mean, a lot of this model has to be conjectural, and I hope briefly to have demonstrated that that conjecture is grounded in research. But at some point, it must be conjecture. And I think it's not a bad thing to do that and then to present a model that is superficially convincing and real looking, as long as we have a discussion, as I've just been having with you, about the limitations of our knowledge and about what we do know and what we don't know. So a model like this, I think, always has footnotes somewhere in its this say, well, this is the sources of information. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is how we filled in the blanks. So that sort of intellectual exercise has to underpin this kind of creation, but the expression of it is visual rather than written, or as well as written, like a standard scholarly output would be. And here is that process speeded up. This is in about 30 seconds, about 5 or 6 years work, starting with a map, as you can see, and putting in initially monochrome versions of these buildings, and then proceeding to colour them in. And I'll play that for you in a minute. But I'll just add that recently I've been experimenting, excuse me, with illustrating conjecture within the model. And I've started creating a toggle within the model so I can turn off the colour in buildings that are conjectural. And I think that would be a good way of presenting in the future, that we can have the full colour model. And then if someone asks, well, how, which buildings do you know for certain and which ones are guesswork, I can then turn off the colour in the conjectural buildings, and we end up with a view a little bit like this, with things I know about for sure in colour and conjectural buildings in white. Anyway, here is that process fast forwarded, working out with colour. In a minute, you'll see I put vegetation in. and color in some texture on the ground plate. And there we go. So that's the process of creating that model, speeded up very rapidly, about 5 years work in about 30 seconds. And hopefully this gives a good overall sense and mix of urban textures, public and private, grand and humble, the big monuments, the villas on the hilltops, the bars in the suburbs, coexisting with the warehouses of the river harbour, the city wall, market gardens and agriculture outside the city, streets of tombs on the arterial roads leading out of the city, a sense of city centre and suburb, kind of a convincing picture of the entire assemblage, the entire environment of the ancient city. So I think this technique, to sum up, has some really promising uses in teaching, and I use it a lot in teaching for school children through to postgraduates, in public-facing work with tourist groups, for example, or people who watch documentaries about ancient Rome and modern Rome, maybe some interesting technological spin-offs in the future with computer games, with virtual reality, and the enjoyable process also sometimes of creating physical models. And I hope one day to bring those lovely models from Narbonne and put them on display somewhere in Oxford. And if I do that, I'm sure the alumni office will let you know. So lots of promise there, also some constraints or some shortcomings or challenges, shall we say, that I think have to be faced up to honestly. But I hope what I've shown is that digital modelling allows another sort of approach to the ancient world, and it suggests a range of questions about how we might imagine and envision and present our understanding of what that world was like. Now, I could go on for hours and take you around other bits of the city and tell you about some research cases I'm putting this to, but I think maybe if I stop at this point and see if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to see what people have to say. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matthew. Do you want to just unshare your screen? And just to pick up what Lindsay and Ruben have put in the chat, that was just fascinating, Matthew. So thank you very much for sharing with us your models of Rome and your special interest in this incredibly interesting field. Lots of questions. I'm going to try and gather them into themes. And perhaps to start off with a fairly broad question posed by Ed White P and also Meg Haig, and it's really about the impact of this work on your understanding and whether it has changed your understanding of ancient Rome. So if I can ask that on their behalf.
It absolutely has. When I started this project, I thought, perhaps arrogantly, that I knew the ancient city pretty well. I really didn't. I've now drawn every building in it. And that, of course, transforms my understanding of how buildings fit together and how they're in kind of dialogue with each other. I think we're used to thinking of the ancient city in plan view. I think we're used to this kind of overhead view that you can see on the screen behind me. I think of it as the ancient Roman helicopter shot. But actually, cities were never experienced like that. They're experienced from ground level. They're experienced often in a kind of confused way where buildings reveal themselves to you as you walk through space. And I think making it in 3D and drawing all the buildings has shown me that. I think Ruskin said, if you want to understand a piece of architecture, really understand it, you have to draw it. And I think that's right. That's essentially what I've done with this. And it has changed my understanding of these spaces. And then viewing them in 3D, in VR rather, changed them again. Even though I built these models and I know the ruins perfectly well, putting a VR helmet on and getting into them was another transformative experience.
Thank you. Then let me bring in some other people who've asked questions along these lines. So can I ask Robert Entwistle? You're one of two people that's actually asked about transport. So would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I'm particularly interested in transport and roads. I edit a journal on that. And I wonder if you've been emphasizing buildings in particular, but you've also been talking about movement through the buildings. And I was wondering whether you get any insights into issues such as traffic movement through ancient Rome, which was clearly a major issue, and they would have had different attitudes to traffic junctions and so on than we might have today. Just wonder whether you have any insights from the work you've done, or whether you think it could potentially develop into that.
Thank you. It's a really good question. And as you'll know, you and other people are doing research into this, looking at curbstone wear patterns in Pompeii and on wheel ruts, trying to think about Roman traffic movements. And I think the model could be used in that way. I haven't really done it yet, but I have talked to people whose expertise is in kind of algorithmic populations of city spaces. And what I think it would be fun to do is to take the model as a kind of a laboratory and put, if you can, like 1 million algorithmic people into it and say, today there's a set of games at the Colosseum, 50,000 people have got to get there from all the suburbs, go, and to see where the bottlenecks and traffic jams are. And that's a piece of work I'd love to do with the right collaborator. So I think it could be used for that. Less technologically, I've just spent quite a long time walking around the city myself on the screen, and it's interesting to see how routes and itineraries through the city that we know about from historical accounts, for example, like the Triumph, to actually walk those routes and see how it would be to move in a big crowd through those spaces and where you would start to feel yourself funneled and bottlenecked with lots of other people. So I think there's a lot more to do. I hope there's quite a lot of potential for this kind of model in that field.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Quick follow-up, Matthew, because someone else has asked it. Aren't all roads in Rome meant to be straight?
Well, Rome's roads, they all lead to Rome, and outside of Rome, they're famously straight. They're surveyed to take the shortest point from A to B, and there's kind of mastery of the landscape thing going on with the Romans, where they like their roads to be big and straight. Rome itself, the centre of Rome, grew up organically from about the 9th century BC onwards, and the Romans were kind of embarrassed. All of their new towns, their colonies, were these wonderful, neat, gridded cities, like new towns in America or Australia are now. But Rome itself was this much more higgledy-piggledy organic mess, and various emperors tried to straighten out the roads, but they never quite got there with all of them.
Thank you. Another question then. How about Kate Buzicki? Would you like to come and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. I was really curious about what the modeling tells you about acoustics. I've always been really curious about how well the people who are in the audience could hear a speaker, like at a political speech or maybe an early church service.
That's my answer to that. Really good question. Like my answer to Robert's about the traffic. I think it could be done. I don't have the expertise to do it myself, but I'd love to work with people who do. And I have talked to a few people who've done acoustic modeling projects. There's a team in America who made a model of the outdoor preaching cross at medieval St. Paul's Cathedral. And then they modeled the acoustic environment around it and worked out, could you actually hear a sermon preached from that outdoor pulpit if you were standing at the back and there were kind of ox carts going by and so on. And you could do the same in the forum if you assigned the right kind of acoustic properties to the materials there. So you made the stone quite reflective and you made any kind of trees or human population quite absorbent of sound. You could then model the sound. You could do it in theatre buildings as well. So that's something I think could be done. And again, it would need a collaborative effort, but it'd be really good to do.
Thank you. There was a question about who your collaborators were. So you've begun to answer that. There is a question, might be the same sort of answer. Ed Simnett, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. A couple of related things. First of all, can we learn anything about the climate of ancient Rome from all the open spaces? And secondly, kind of on the transport point, is this would you say this is an early example of the first city where a river was managed in the sense, obviously the rivers are no longer being allowed to flow freely if they're going through a town with a port?
They tried very hard to manage the river. There were all sorts of very ambitious projects to canalize it and move it away from the center of town, which never came off. And the problem of Tiber flooding was only really solved with the enormous embankments that now surround the Tiber, actually rather sadly cut it off from the rest of the city, but with the happy result it no longer inundates the monumental heart of the city every few years. So they tried to manage the river, but I don't think they ever fully got on top of that in the ancient past. In terms of climate, that's an interesting question. I think it shows, for example, in the distribution of buildings, I have to be careful not to fall into a circular argument. I make the city in a certain way, having said that quite a lot of it's conjecture, and then I find certain findings from the way in which I happen to have made it. But I think it is true to say that there's a contrast between hilltop and valley bottom, for example, that the valley bottoms, you get big arterial roads, very dense building, high density residential, high density commercial. And the hilltops, you get much more gracious parkland and big elite villas and garden spaces because they're enjoying the views, but also the breezes, especially in the summer when it gets very, very hot. The city can be malarial. So it does show us something about how the city adapted to its climate, I think.
Thank you. Very interesting. how about Jeffrey Baldwin? Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. My question was, you've got these massive buildings, so but what were the construction methods used to erect them? And that, of course, touches on the transport, because all the material would have had to have been brought into the city, to say nothing of housing the huge labor force needed. Thank you.
It's an excellent question. It was all built by human and some animal motive power. They were limited by the tensile strength of wooden and hemp rope in their cranes. And with those very profound limitations, they did an awful lot of amazing things. And the difficulty was part of the point. So, for example, the big imperial temples, I don't know how many of you have got the pamphlet in front of you, but if you look at the columns in the porch, those are monolith shafts of Egyptian granite from Aswan. So they were hand quarried in Egypt, loaded onto barges, towed up the Nile, put onto ships, shipped across the Mediterranean to a port somewhere outside Rome, put onto ox carts or trundled up the roads, and then moved, as you say, through the city on carts through these winding narrow roads I've already talked about, brought onto site, and then lifted up vertical and put into place using these, by our standards, rather primitive cranes. So with the technology they had, they did absolutely amazing things. They were extremely efficient builders. And one of the great Roman innovations that enabled the city that you saw on the screen is their use of concrete. So whereas the Greeks tended to build their monuments out of hand-cut dressed masonry, ashlar stone, solid stone, the Romans built out of concrete and then put a stone veneer on the outside. And that meant they could build quickly and cheaply, because concrete, you can bring it onto site in kind of sacks over your back, right, rather than huge stone blocks. You can mix it and lay it with relatively unskilled or semi-skilled labor. So they effectively turned their building sites into production lines, and they could create enormous buildings very quickly. So the Baza Caracalla that I opened with, which is comparable in size to a European cathedral that would have taken 200-300 years to build, they built that in less than a decade. So they built really efficiently and cleverly using the technology they had at the time. And they wrote books about it, Vitruvius, so we can read about their construction methods.
So just a question that's just come in, which sort of relates to this, which is Martin Willie. Do you want to ask yours, Martin? And do feel free to come on the screen if you want to.
Thank you. I'm intrigued about how you handle the situation of a city that was obviously evolving over centuries. Did you pick a particular date? How did you pick that? And did you take any liberties with that, or did you stick strictly to the date that you chose?
Oh, the answer to the last question is both yes and no. So the date I picked is AD 310, 315, and that's in the reign of the Emperor Constantine. And the reason for that is that, as you'll know, he founded Constantinople, modern Istanbul, Byzantium. And from that point onwards, the Roman Empire split. Rome's primacy as a capital city started to fade away. Other cities, Ravenna, Trier, Milan, Constantinople, took priority, and Rome started to crumble away. And then it was invaded by the Goths, the aqueducts were cut, and we entered the Middle Ages, and the city declined down to maybe 20,000 people. So I picked a moment at which the city was at its height, when all, as I rather cavalierly said earlier, the best buildings coexisted at the same time, before things started to transform with, the shift to Christianity meant they built different kinds of buildings. They started pulling down the imperial buildings to build churches and basilicas. So that's the reason for choosing that date. It's the high water mark of imperial Rome. But what I'd really like to do is make 5 or 6 of these models and have a time slider, because, as I said in passing in the talk, actually I should be differentially aging my buildings so that things that are new in AD 315 look new and things that are old look old. And I haven't done that. Also, buildings overlay each other all the time. Things burn down, get pulled down, rebuilt over the top. And we could make, in any given part of Rome, 5 or 6 Romes showing how the city evolved over time. So I would love to do more of it. This one took me about 10 years, and I'm quite busy senior tutoring these days. So making 5 or 6 of them would take a long time, but it'd be a nice ambition to have.
Thank you.
Yes, so Jake Hatton did ask, how finished do you think your model is?
Oh, well, how long's a piece of string, Jake? It's good enough that I can do the kinds of things I've been doing with it, but I would never call it finished. And in fact, I'm rebuilding all of it substantially at the moment to take advantage of some new mapping resources that are now available. So ongoing labor of love.
And so Patrick Ingram has a question about your models.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, just wanted to ask, how many colours did you choose to use to display the buildings? And how consistent might they have been at the time, and what might have made them dirtier?
Colouring is a really, really interesting question. There's been quite a lot of debate, even controversy that you may have seen in the last decade or so about how brightly coloured Roman buildings, particularly statues, were. This idea of a white marble city is really kind of 18th century neoclassical ideal. And we now think that Roman cities were much more colourful. So I have put bits and bobs of architectural colour into my model, but not as much as maybe I could have done, partly because I'm not confident actually in the colour palette, partly because, as you suggest, these things would have faded quite quickly. Wood smoke for sure, just rain, atmospheric climatic effects. They've been touched up every few years, no doubt, so that you'd actually get probably a patchwork of different kinds of colour on buildings. What I have got in there is the natural colour of the building materials. So you can just see, just impressionistically on the screen behind me, kind of honey-coloured terracotta, buff-coloured terracotta, honey-coloured travertine and other kind of marbles. So there's colour in there that comes from the natural properties of the building materials, but paint colour, I think I could do more of in the future.
Thank you. Leslie Ann, do you want to come on with your son to ask his question?
Okay. Hello.
Oh, hello, Leslie Ann. Hello, nice to see you.
If you had a favourite house in Rome, which would it be and would you live in it?
Ah, okay, favourite house. Well, I probably, out of all the houses, like the Emperor Augustus's house on the Palatine Hill. He was the first emperor of Rome. I'll find you his house while we're talking. So maybe you can see that big model of the city now. If I can find my trackpad, we'll go and explore it. He was the first emperor, and he was a very clever and astute emperor because he did build a luxurious palace for himself, but he took care not to make it too big and too luxurious. And the result, here it is, on this part of the Palatine Hill. The result is that it's a very elegant building, and it survives, or bits of it survive, and the frescoes are just gorgeous in there. So it's this, later emperors got a bit grandiose, like Nero with his golden house, and a bit overblown. I thought Augustus was actually a very tasteful man. So I think I'd probably like Augustus's house, but I don't think I'd like to live in it because there's no electricity or Wi-Fi, all the things that make modern life. I'd like to visit it, I think I'd say.
Thank you. So I think this will have to be our final question, and I'm bringing in Harold Riot here because he's asked two questions. He's obviously a very good friend, former chorister with Matthew. I'm going to ban his existential question about why did you abandon all this to become a senior tutor? But I want, Harold, would you like to ask your other question, which is a very general question?
Sure. Libraries are, I know, a big theme for you. We had one you did in our time on the Library of Alexandria. We had Dr. Hacker as our senior librarian to thank for a wonderful library, still being run by Ruth Ogden, such an important part of college life. And actually, I'll combine the two questions by asking Digital Detox. Our peer Tom Chatfield wrote How to Thrive in the Digital Age, a book that everyone should buy. And I wonder whether you could say something about the role, the balance of what you think as a digital expert and a lover of books and a senior tutor. What is the balance of our relationship with books and our ideal relationship with digital assets in an era when many students are spending lots of time on screens where the Romans would have had these wonderful rows of books?
Thanks, Harold. How nice to see you. Good evening. That's a really lovely question. I do think about it professionally and personally, and in my kind of senior tutor role and in my researching role as well. I think COVID has given us some pointers here. Almost all the knowledge in the world is now available on screens, right? And some forms of knowledge work much more efficiently and better digitally than in paper books. So things where you want to click around from link to link, or you want to show, like I've been doing, a moving image, an animated image, or has something interactive. So digital has affordances, so digital educational resources have affordances that are new and exciting and really worthwhile. Do they replace books? No, I don't think they do, nor should they. We all love books. I hope we all love books. I, like you, have shelves full of books. And there's something satisfying, and not just satisfying, but also really efficient about the paper book as an educational tool. I'm sure the President has thoughts about that as well from her line of work. Interesting you're saying about students spending a lot of time on screens. Yes, they do. I guess I'm sort of encouraging them to do so with some of the work that I do, but they also crave time face-to-face. They crave time with their tutors. COVID showed us this all the way through COVID. They long to be back in college, and now they're here. They're using the library study centre a lot. And what a joy that is. They want a space that is about meeting, interacting with each other and with physical books. And I don't think that's going to go away.
Harold, you asked me to comment, I think, as a psychologist, and I just, well, I think one thing we do need to remember is that books aren't accessible to everybody. So the digital world gives much more access. Of course, it gives much more international access as well to things like our wonderful archives and other digital collections. But just as Matthew said, over and above everything else, when our governing body said books are going out of fashion, why do you want to build a library? The students said we need a place to be, a place to think, to reflect, and to work without distraction. And I think even for those of us, some scientists like me mostly access papers online, to have a library in which to work is just really, really incredible. But Matthew, I think we are going to have to draw to a close. There are more questions. There are questions about what was happening about food and the food markets. Quite a lot of questions around how much detail you needed to produce a work and so on and so forth. But I know that we'll capture them in the chat, and I'm sure that you can contact the alumni and answer those outstanding questions. And indeed, any other questions that you've got, if you can let Rebecca in the alumni office know, she will forward them to Matthew. She also in the chat, she's posted those wonderful QR codes. But it just remains for me to thank Matthew for a really fantastic, fascinating lecture, and to wish him well juggling between 3D constructions of ancient Rome and being our wonderful senior tutor. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye everyone.
Thank you all very much for coming along. It's been a joy.
Thank you.